It was not for live. I relog in and corrected those things. Give me just a second. I'll make sure.
Audio off. Would you just make it?
I got a couple parts. Just got a
Oh, wait, no, I can play.
That should have been. We're holding this for a sec because it didn't want to start the stream. So you can check to make sure it is.
Creating a successful business. Is that one yours? Creating a successful business? That's yours? Send it to presentation at Mount.
Oh, I'm not done.
Just make sure to share it. Presentations at Mount. Presentation. Just presentation at Mount. Well, you can stop
I did a second run.
I'll try it.
Oh, wait. Alright, we're on. Yeah, we got good. 3 minutes. We got good.
Yeah, so it's streaming everything.
So you're gonna run,
I take the, I should really just have her do it. Take the test for advisor, which has who's she? Yeah, she went back to answer my account.
Oh, you guys voted. They would have put it against the wrong.
Yeah, we should do.
Get it set up.
Just wait till it's like 5 minutes.
Okay.
I'll watch it. Oh, yeah.
That's slow actually, yeah, we got 1 minute.
Okay, John.
It's already up.
Sorry, hold on a second. What? I go outside. Can you go outside?
Yeah, finish this.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to my presentation about COVID-19's impacts on society during and after the recent pandemic, presented by yours truly. First off, a quick table of contents.
It's just.
Okay, yeah. First off, a quick table of context. First off is my introduction, which is going to include my why and driving question, my data, which is split into my research for my research paper, and my interviews. And last off is my conclusion, where I summarize everything that I learned from this, and also my answer to my driving question. So first off, my introduction. So first off, why am I doing COVID-19? Why am I doing this subject in particular? First off, I believe that at this point, we have finally gotten out of the height of the pandemic. Even though it is still around and it's still prevalent, it's not a major threat nowadays. So I think now is a better time than any to look at this virus for what it has caused for our race. Second of all, is I myself have been affected, probably many of you have too, by the pandemic. Some by fear of people getting sick, and also people in my family actually getting sick. Sad, luckily, none died, but still, it was a very scary time for probably all of us in general. And that's mainly the reason why I think this is a very interesting subject to look at. So what exactly did I look at for my project? So I decided to look at a wide range for my project when it comes to not just people, but also the country in general. So I looked at the economy, mostly just how did it fare during the pandemic. Mostly to see on one, how much did it suffer, and two, if it actually did fully recover. Second of all is government, like what policies were put into it and have those been somewhat released? And lastly, because I think it's interesting, how did people react to that? Because everyone's a little bit political about what the government does, so I was thinking it'd be interesting to look at that too. Third of all is people, and mostly just how did people fare during the pandemic. I've already kind of given you an idea of how I fared, and all of you guys have your own ways that you dealt with COVID. So I was looking at the wide majority of people in the country and how did they feel and experience COVID. Lastly, which is kind of related to people, it's mostly just, I want to look at people on the front lines. Because even though we have our own experiences at home, how do people who are actually dealing with it head on actually feel? It probably is a lot of stress and stuff to deal in the workplace. So I thought it would be a very interesting field to look at, because I've never actually heard a lot about how people are experiencing in these fields are dealing with COVID. Okay, so to summarize all this data, I decided to make this driving question. How has COVID-19 affected people, economies, and governments during and post COVID-19? So second part is my data. And first off, I'm going to talk about what I did for research. So this is the main stuff I did for research. As I already mentioned before, it's economy, government, and people. And first off, we'll start with economy. So as we all know, the economy suffered. With it coming out of nowhere, no one was able to properly prepare for the pandemic. And even if some people were to prepare in some ways, like for example, our schools are getting prepared by getting some Zoom stuff set up, we still weren't fully able to understand what was actually going to happen. And later, we did, well, now we're about 3 years later, roughly, and how exactly did we recover? So this is a more updated graph, but still it shows that even in a couple of years after COVID, people are still not fully recovered. Like some countries are still doing better than others. I'm not saying that no one has recovered from the pandemic, but it still has some damage on many countries. And not just countries, but also our own communities too. First off, the closing of small businesses. Because many of these small businesses were in-person shopping. They had to quickly adapt to online websites to actually be able to survive. And unless they did that, what many of them weren't, they would have to close. And a main reason why also they would have to close was because of lack of tourism. And as also Alyssa mentioned before, our economy is based on tourism. It's a main part of it. And for that, our economy suffered during that period of time. And luckily, we have passed out of that, but still, if we don't find a way to change our economy so it's not fully based on this, and something like this happens again, we're going to suffer even more than we did before. Second of all is government. And what I'm mostly talking about, as I already mentioned, government policies that happened during the time. So when looking at it, I found 4 main ones that most of you guys are probably going to even know. First off, masks. Everyone knows masks. They were able to prevent, or not prevent, but halt the spread of the virus. It wasn't a foolproof method. Still, people got sick. Not all masks work the same. And also, if you talk to someone with a mask, it's not gonna mean it's 100% guarantee that you're not gonna get sick. But still, it helped in some ways. Some people didn't approve of this, and this is mostly because of different people's ideas of what they think of a control or freedom. And these ideas made some people more accepting of some of these policies and some of them not. For this one, most people obliged with it. It was annoying. I'm not going to say it wasn't annoying, but it was something that helped people to stay safe and it helped people to stay alive. Second off is quarantine. This was, you guys all know what quarantine is, the quick closing down of most stuff. This was the most rushed thing because it just 1 second we were just outside doing stuff. Next thing we know, God, we have to stay inside for like 3 months or at that point it was more like 4. And this one was just so out of nowhere. It caused a lot of different issues to pile up, which I will talk about later with my people section. Second off is vaccine. First off, I'm gonna say this because I think it's amazing. They made the vaccine so quickly. Like compared to other vaccines that were ever made, this vaccine was made so fast and so efficiently compared to any other one before. But the thing is though, there were groups that obviously opposed to this. Obviously, you can think of one group, the anti-vaxxer group. And this made it so, and this is, even though it's a small group, it made it so the ideas of anti-vaccination was something that was spreading around. Mostly this is due to social media or other sites, but it was still an issue that came up and something that made it so that the distribution of the vaccine was a little bit more difficult than it should have been. Lastly is stimulus check. This one was effective. But the issue with this one exactly is that if you're given free money to do whatever you want, you won't value that as much as if you actually worked for it. So instead of, let's say for instance, saving it for the entire month, because that's when you would get a single check, you probably spend it on a bunch of stuff and then won't have them, or you'd probably spend most of it on some random stuff and then you wouldn't really have enough left over. Unlike with your actual money, which you would want to save and spend over time in little amounts. And that is one issue. And that, even though is a smaller issue, the main one was that once we got out of COVID, many people still kept using stimulus checks because for some people, it was more than what they actually got paid per year. So they just kept using it and just stayed at home and did nothing. So that was one issue that we couldn't really do much about. Last off, and what I think is the most interesting topic in my opinion, is the people section. And mostly, as you can read there, emotional and mental health of people during the time. So quarantine, as I already mentioned, was out of nowhere. We didn't know what was going to happen. It was also a complete unknown when the virus would end. Many people said at the beginning, like a couple of months, maybe 6. And it lasted over 2 years. If you shared that with us in the past, we would be freaking out. That would be the shared feeling with everyone. So some of the things that emotions I'm going to demonstrate here are: 1, fear of getting sick, fear of sickness that is spreading, and just in general, also fear of getting someone else sick. Because say even though you get it and you're not that affected, what about another family member? You wouldn't want to. That fear of spreading it is something that you can't really feel anywhere else. Another emotion that was prevalent was depression, or just general sadness general sadness, because as I said, you're locked inside for a long period of time. Some people were just locked in their homes alone, and they just had to stay there waiting for something to happen, something good, and that didn't really happen for a long period of time. So many people got major forms of depression, and this also led to higher suicide rates as a result. Last off, and this one's not one prevalent now, but also just fear of the unknown. Because as I mentioned, we didn't know when the virus would end. We don't know what's going on. No one knew anything. So this fear was one of the biggest things that came up during this time, and sadly, that fear also, as I mentioned, caused a lot of mental illnesses, like anxieties, like major forms of stress, and as I already mentioned, depression. So now to my interviews. So I interviewed 3 people in total. All of them worked in different forms in the medical industry. The first one is my aunt, Marcy Borden. She is a nurse who's worked for over 29 years. She's worked in multiple different places in the hospital, mostly in the ICU, like transplant ICU, neuroscience ICU, and also the critical care unit. She has worked in there for a long period of time, so I wanted to see her experiences with COVID firsthand. Next one, and one you probably already know, is Mr. Brown, or Isla's father, who works in pharmaceutical distribution and is one of the main, and when I talked to him, was one of the main people who distributed the vaccine to Maui. Last off is a man named Dr. Powers. He was the previous dean of Campbell University during COVID-19, to be more specific, of the medical school there. And I wanted to talk to him to get some insight about how it was to change the programs during COVID-19 and what exactly he had to do during that time. First off is my aunt. So I want to talk about struggles during COVID. And what I mostly found out was that she was in a state of constant fear during it. Mostly just obvious fear of getting the virus. That was a prevalent one. And also fear of just seeing other people. She could see the fear in her patient's eyes of not knowing exactly if they will recover. And that's something that weighed on her heavily. And one of the things that she said that helped her during that time was trying to stay positive. She struggled a lot during this period of time, which she mentioned multiple times. And she kept trying to keep herself positive, as probably all of us were during this period of time. And I could feel it in her when she was saying this, and I think she still is dealing with some of this stress now. Last part is seeing people lose others, seeing many people lost due to COVID, and seeing families come in who weren't even able to see their families pass away was something that weighed on her heavily, and it was very hard to hear in general. Next part is distribution of the vaccine to Maui. So one thing, as I already mentioned, how he was kind of shocked on how fast the process was, as I already mentioned before. So I'll kind of skip over that part. Next off, as I mentioned, also mistrust in the vaccine, which was, as I already said, prevalent. It was an issue, but we're already past. But luckily, most of that is past now. There is still anti-vaxxers that still exist, but so far, mistrust in the vaccine has mostly been soothed over. Last off is him talking about distribution to hospitals and elderly care centers. What I mostly mean by that is just him making sure that the people there are going to be safe, because these people are in critical care and have weak immune systems. So them so distributing these vaccines to make sure that they stay safe during this time was extremely important. And I was impressed, and I was very impressed and also very grateful for him actually doing this to make sure that we all stay safe. Last off is teaching a new generation in a new generation. First off, he rushed to find a new system. He was the dean, or he was put in the dean position 2 months prior to the pandemic. Like, he had to rush to find a new, and when he did that, he had to rush to find a new system. It was it took about, from what he said, around a month or two to find a new system. You could probably guess it was Zoom stuff and telehealth. But thing is, though, even with that, there was no hands-on studies. Because around in the fourth and third years, they were given on hands-on studies for them to actually see what it is to work like in an actual hospital. Get them real life experience to make sure that they know what they're doing. So without this experience, I was kind of questioning, are these new doctors that are going to be graduating actually up to the task? Like, can they actually do what they need to do in a real life setting? And that's one of the things that he did mention. He did say that because of this, there is more stress among these new doctors coming out because they don't know what they're doing. And they're going into this highly stressful situation where a life will be on the line. And it was something that I was a little bit shocked hearing, because these new doctors are coming out into a panicked world. And that's something I don't think any of us would want to do. Last off is my conclusion. So what I saw through this was that there was a lot of damage brought to many of the things I talked about. But there has been recovery. Some people have gotten better. Systems have adapted and changed. But there is still damage that can't be reversed. There will still, even though we have been dashed, there are still scars left over. And that's why, as I put for my answer, although some of the damage of the pandemic has been resolved, COVID-19 has left irreversible damage to the economy, government policies, different societies dealing with mental problems, and the medical industry as a whole. So what do I hope to do in the future with this project? I felt like the most interesting part of my project was the stuff dealing with people. To be more specific, the stuff dealing with the medical workers. I feel like that's not shared as much as it should. So in the future, I do hope to focus more on the medical field, and either one, continue on something with COVID or doing something with actual mental health inside of the hospital in general. And thank you for listening.
Okay, this is my project. I did my research on creating a successful business, and so this is my table of contents. Talk about my driving question and my three strands, and then I'll go to my conclusion. All right. So for my first strand, this is my driving question. My driving question I came up with are what steps are required to creating a successful business. And this led me to my first strand. Through my research, I found that you need your documents to create this business. And I found that one of the most important documents you could have is a good business plan. Because a business plan, it really it maps out your future, so you can really see what's coming up, and you should plan for what you're gonna do. And another one being permits. Permits are important. It really depends on your company. For example, if you have a retail store, it may require you to have like a sales tax license. Or if you're having a restaurant, you may need a food service permit. So it depends on your company. So you really need to look into that as you're planning it out. And then another one would be insurance. This helps protect your company. Some examples would be liability insurance, which protects from injuries that occur at the workplace, or property, which protects it from damages done to your like physical assets. And this insurance is determined by the business or location. So for example, if you're in a place with like a lot of hurricanes, like you're in Florida or something, you may need hurricane insurance. But if you're in like Wisconsin where there's not many hurricanes, you probably don't need that. So this leads me to my second strand, which is location. Location is very important. You should be very visible and accessible to everyone. Everyone should be able to see it. The better the street presence is, the better your store looks, the more people are likely to enter it and check it out. And if it's in an area where there's a lot of traffic, a lot of people see this, they're likely to go in, check it out, and the more people in it, the more people buy. So it's better for business. And another one is competition. So when you're choosing a location and you don't know like if you should go here or not, one thing you can look at is competition. If there's a lot of people that are selling the same stuff as you or doing the same thing as you, maybe you look at it. If there's a lot of people there, maybe you should choose a different location where there's less competition. And then another thing that leads kind of similar to this is supply and demand. So what is needed? Another thing is this also helps you determine what you're gonna make your business in. So say you have a location, you know what you wanna, where you wanna be, but you don't know what you're gonna sell. So you can look at that area and see what is needed, what is not really sold there, and what can I sell. So this helps you really plan out your whole thing. And then my third strand was funding. So funding is really important. You know, there's many different ways, but two of the ones that I found that most people do when they're creating their business is one, they save up their own money. They try to fund this their own, so they would save up, they put money aside for their business, and they'd wait for the money to start coming in. And then another one would be applying for a loan. Loans could be good because they could be structured to like fit your needs and everything, but there's some things that you might have to look at when you're going for a loan. They have strict requirements to see if you're eligible. So they look at your like tax credit and stuff. And then another thing is if you're planning on your business to pay this off and you aren't making profit, you're gonna have trouble finding ways to pay off these payments, right? And so if you miss your payments or something, it could cause like high interest rates, and that's not really something to look at when you're looking for a loan. And so that leads me to my conclusion where I answer my driving question. So some major components of creating a successful business is good documents, a great location, and funding. And so, yeah, but something that I would like to do further with this is work with someone to see firsthand experience, kind of like what Pierce did, like working with someone to see how they run their business, how they created it. And that's something that I wanted to do this year, but I wasn't able to because everyone dropped out on me. But I think that'll be something fun to do furthermore. But yeah, thank you.
So I chose to do my presentation on evolution of architecture in Hawaii. And so my table of contents will be about my project, my three strands, my internship, and then my reflection. So why did I choose this topic? I'm passionate in things relating to STEM. And so I thought, even though architecture isn't a classical STEM, it does apply to all of the concepts within it. So that's why I chose it. So my driving question, based off of my interest in STEM related things, which ended up in architecture, was what is our traditional Hawaiian architecture and how has it evolved over time until now? So traditional Hawaiian architecture was very important to indigenous people for cultural practices and beliefs, which was my first find. And these were one of the types of heiau was luakini, and the purpose of these were offering to the gods in human or animal bloodshed, and they were used by Hawaiian kings and their delegates to do that. So they were composed mostly of large stone platforms or simple earth terraces. So they weren't very complex to make, but they took a lot of labor, and so they took a long time to build. So early Hawaiian homes. So archaeologists found that on the accounts of early voyagers indicated that the structures were 6 by 8 foot sheds, and those were used for storages, while smaller houses averaged 18 feet long by 12 feet wide, while the larger ones were about 50 feet long by 30 feet wide. And of course, royalty had bigger than these homes. These were just like average sized for churches and normal buildings. So the traditional Hawaiian houses were made by fixing posts in the ground, fastening poles in the form of rafters to them, and tying in a compact manner bundles of long grass to traverse sticks. Framing members were lashed together with a variety of local fibers and thatched with bundles of grasses and sedges, banana trunk fiber, or leaves such as pandanus, ki, and sugarcane. So Anglo-Hawaiian European architecture. So in the early 19th century, basically what I got from this strand was that Hawaiian architecture improved as a result of arrival of Protestant missionaries to Hawaii in 1820. So New England vernacular architecture. So New England actually imported materials including wood, which helped speed up how they could like build homes and what materials they could use. And so the design of homes was good enough for someone from the United States to be impressed, which is what I found from a quote in my research. And missionary and Hawaiian builders developed and constructed bicultural Anglo-Hawaiian architecture. Basically, these were a combination between modern missionary style houses and like traditional Hawaiian homes. And so the use of introduced architectural forms by Hawaiians and foreigners in Hawaii began no later than 1800. And by the time American Protestant missionaries arrived in 1820, a handful of wood frame, coral, and adobe houses lined the wood frame, coral, and Honolulu front. Major development occurred in 1800 when Kamehameha I workers built the first modern structure, that being a brick house in Lahaina, Maui, named the Brick Palace. So the Brick Palace was very important, significant, because Hawaiians started trusting that missionaries would be able to build like quality homes because Kamehameha I actually trusted in them, and because he was their leader, it was their king. It was very significant. So three big projects in the early 20th century. So there was three major projects in the early 20th century that really stood out. The Greek Theater Project, as the name implies, is pure classical revival architecture. However, the early schemes for the Bishop and Company Bank and the Castle and Cook building conformed with 20th century design, which was like more modern than traditional thatched roofing and those things. So American influence on landscape architecture. So what I found for my third strand was that America greatly impacted how gardening and landscape should look in Hawaii. And so knowledge was limited on what plants were best for growing in Hawaii. And it was on accident that they found out, because of their homesickness, that certain plants would grow there. So they brought other plants that would better suit to grow in Hawaii, and around the mid to late 20th century. So my internship with Kaspersky Designs. So with Adam, I actually was able to see him use ArchiCAD, which is a very expensive $20,000 a year architectural program, which basically allows you to model things and like build structures online. And so these are two of the images of him using it. The left one's a little blurry, but it's It's a 2D version. So on these two, I was looking at, so on top of just the architectural aspects of the internship, I also got to learn about permitting and how he ran his business. And so the kitchen, and so on top of that, the kitchen, so this is supposed to be a amusement park's kitchen that is coming up for Flight of Aloha. It's a project that should be done in about a year or so. And so they're modeling it right now. They were modeling it a couple weeks ago. So yeah, that's it. Thanks for listening.
All right, let's get the tables and chairs rearranged for Mr. Van Dyke.